Okay, I'm going to go ahead and call the meeting to order. Welcome, everybody, to this meeting at Coeur d'Alene School District 271 for August 24th. Would the gentlemen please remove their hats, and everyone, let's stand for the Pledge of Allegiance. Pledge allegiance
to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Okay, before we get going, I just want to introduce our participants up front here tonight. My name is Casey Morrisrow, and I'm our board chair. To my far right is Rebecca Smith, board member, and Lisa May, board member. Behind them is Lynn Town, our board clerk. To my left is Jennifer Brumley, our vice chair, and Tambra Pickford, board member. And then to Tambra's left is Dr. Cook, our superintendent. No public comment will be taken at tonight's workshop, but as always, it can be submitted to the board in writing through our clerk. Is there a motion to approve tonight's agenda?
So moved.
Second.
Okay, thank you. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Okay, and is there a motion to approve consent agenda item A?
Second.
Okay, it's been moved and seconded. Any discussion? All right, all in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Aye. Okay, motion carries, Ms. Town. All right, let's move into our action items here. And Dr. Cook, I'll turn it over to you, please.
So a very busy lead up coming into this meeting tonight. We've got a lot of things that we would like to have the board's approval on, specifically some policy modifications, a resolution, and the documents that are the essentially the beginning and the start of the reopening plan. For your consideration, there are, I think, 18 different documents attached to the reopening plan for discussion tonight. Most of those are documents that you've seen in the past. There are a couple of brand new ones, but we've got, if you guys are so inclined, we've got language incorporated in there for how we could adapt these into action for the district. They've been out for public comment. We have made some modifications to the plan and to a few things. And I think we've listed each one out separately so that we would have the opportunity to talk about each and every one of them, or also do them all as one unit if there are no questions. But I think the beginning of that would be starting with the policy questions that we would be modifying first. And if you recall, those were the ones. We've got a communicable and infectious disease policy, telecommuting policy, and then how staff could access their sick leave if in a situation in which they would be, it would be necessary for them to quarantine. So I'll stop there for just that first section, and then we'll move into the reopening plan after that, if we could.
Okay, so any questions about those policy revisions? We saw those a few weeks ago, and they've been out for public comment here. Megan, how are we going through these? Are we, this is, I guess, or Dr. Cook, what step comes first as we're working through these and approving these? Do we need to do the resolution first, or are we going through all this, then approving the resolution, and then each individual item?
I would suggest that we do the policy changes first.
Okay.
And then we talk about the reopening plan. Let's make sure that we've got all the components in there. And once we feel like we've got the reopening plan, if there needs to be changes or modifications, we would then go adopt the reopening plan, and then acceptance of the resolution as it's written then pushes everything into that kind of packaging. Is that?
Yeah, Chair Morrisrow, members of the board, Dr. Cook, I think it is a little bit clunky and unusual, and it'll be similar to what we did a week ago, where the board could approve the language alone, with respect to the policies and the plan as presented by the administration. And then the formal adoption will happen by means of the resolution with the changes as revised by the board tonight. That makes sense.
It does, now that you say it, I see it was written that way, whoever did that for us as far as a
Yeah.
motion. So it's a motion would be to approve the language revisions to the following policies. 3520, 5405, and 5215, when we're ready for that. Any discussion on those policies? Someone want to make the motion then?
I might not have a much comment, but Steve, have you heard from your staff on the sick leave policy? Are they comfortable? I know we got some feedback, but this directly affects them, so I want to ensure that.
Yeah, I think originally it was a little concerning. It's, the impact of a potential positive exposure can be fairly substantial. And currently, unless they're symptomatic and knowingly sick, they wouldn't even qualify to access their sick bank. And so this gives this policy, if approved, would give us the authority and the ability to allow that to apply to their sick bank once they ran out of their emergency FMLA leave. And I think generally, first of all, that was not necessarily known. And the emergency FMLA leave, which is approved through the end of the 2020 year, not even everybody was aware of that. And so they assumed that if they got sent home, that it was just going to be without pay potentially. And so there's a lot of flexibility here, and there's a lot of opportunity. We're also working now on some other aspects on ways to protect our employees from this. And so it's been very well received. We haven't had, with the exception of people who perhaps are uniquely situated right now to be close to retirement, in which their sick leave gives them, they can utilize their sick leave in a bank that pays the gap between now and when they would qualify for Medicare. That's unique to the state, that those people are in a situation where they would, potentially be feeling like that's a financial loss to them. But we've worked it through. The challenging piece would be only those exceptions if we had somebody that just happened to be in a tough spot where they wound up being quarantined multiple times and either couldn't work from home or for whatever reason in their role. That was a challenge. So generally it's been very positively received. Yeah.
I will move to approve the language revisions to the following proposed policies. Policy 3520, communicable and infectious diseases, which would be Exhibit A of COVID resolution. Policy 5405, personnel sick leave, which would be Exhibit B to the COVID resolution, and Policy 5215, emergency telecommuting, which would be Exhibit C to the COVID resolution.
Second.
Okay, thank you. It's been moved and seconded. Any discussion on the motion? Okay, all in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Motion carries, Ms. Town. Okay. And next, we're going to go into the reopening plan itself. Is that correct?
Okay. All right, so the first thing I would tell you is that the reopening plan itself is essentially the same. We tweaked some language on the titles, but essentially very little differences, with some minor feedback and aligning some language in the components of the plan. There are 3 new documents in this plan that are located in the appendices. Those 3 documents are listed for you. The infection control plan, a discussion or a plan about how we would use collaboration time differently, and we can talk about that a little further. And then a mechanism that has been kind of built in partnership with our health leaders in the community, both with Kootenai Health and with the public health entity, the Panhandle Health District, has helped us build some gating criteria, if you will, for how we would change from category to category that helps inform our decision making. And I would just remind the board that that decision ultimately resides with the 5 of you, and how you would vote with that. We would likely be getting advisement from the health district and potentially our medical partners at Kootenai Health to give us feedback on that. But what we've done with this document, and you also notice that we've got a hard copy of that document sitting at your table to kind of look at the criteria that we would tend to make those category shifts, those decisions upon, and how we would move from green to yellow, yellow to orange, orange to red, and then vice versa if necessary. And we're glad to talk that through with you, but I would like to stop at this point and just say there's 18 appendices to this document. There's a lot there. We've made substantial, I think it's fair to say, substantial changes to the extracurricular policy work in this plan. And we're fortunate in that Chair Morrisroe was a part of that committee. And I've also got Kelly Nichols, our Assistant Superintendent for Secondary, waiting, prepared to talk about that process also, if you will. And I think there's a lot there. I think I'm going to stop talking about all of that right now and see where we might have questions to start with, either in any of those new documents or in the reopening plan as a general document.
So if we're looking in our board book, Dr. Cook, we're kind of starting at item 8 through 21. Is that correct as far as what falls under the?
8
or no, 22.
8 through 22, I think. No, 8 through 8 through 25. Well, 8 through 24, and then public comment on, is 25.
So maybe just for my peace of mind, for just organizational, if we can kind of go down through these, just starting at, some of them are just reference documents from the state, right?
Right.
But if we could start at either 8 and work our way down, or I think is where we'd be, and just address questions on the exhibits if there are any, and then we can look to approve the plan. Does that make sense? Okay. So on number 8, we've had quite a bit of discussion around that, but questions, comments, concerns?
This is just a question that I received from a community member. Got it. And it's under the framework if we're opening in category orange, about visitors. And maybe Dr. Cook, you could just clarify. It says no outside visitors, but then there's some stipulations. So parents are just wondering about volunteering. So under orange, would we still be utilizing parent volunteers, or would we be holding off until we move back to yellow?
We would currently minimize the use of volunteers in orange, but I don't think it's, in a blanket statement, I can say that they would be completely shut down, because some of our volunteers are critical to the success of our schools. And I do think that we would definitely try to take a minimal effort when it comes to accessing volunteers while we're in orange.
Okay, any other questions? Okay, document number 9 is just a state document that we're familiar with. And 10 is the blended learning framework. I believe we saw this back in June.
We approved this last in the August board meeting as well.
Okay, how about the transitional, reopening transitions? I believe you had a few tweaks in that this week. Is that correct?
That is correct. One of the things that we decided we felt like we needed to put in for the reopening, remember the premise of this document is how we're going to handle transitions from category to category. We started this plan with the idea that there needs to be a pretty thoughtful approach when we're going to go from a less restrictive category to a more restrictive category. Upon further discussion, we've realized, I think, that it's just as important to attend to the needs of both students and staff and families when you're going from a more restrictive category to a less restrictive category. In essence, it lays out the district kind of expectations and the way that we would handle that. Ultimately, when we would do a transition, we would do it with a week's run-up of notice. And so this board we would ask for a board meeting, and we'd say, at this point, we believe that it's time to do a transition in some fashion, whether that's going from yellow to orange or orange to yellow, and do essentially a 1 week notice, and get then to kind of put, if the board approves that recommendation, puts the district kind of on notice that the following, if we did it on a Monday, the following Monday would be when that change in category would take place. And this part of the transition, number 11, the recommendation actually maps out those teacher moves for how to do that successfully.
And one quick question off of that. So if folks are watching, online and Panhandle switches their metrics, just to be clear, because we can watch, where they place us kind of online. It's not just going to happen overnight, is what.
That's correct.
I just wanna-
Yeah, and I would say, and I don't want to get too far into the weeds here, but there's going to be a conversation later. We're going to talk about the metrics a little bit, and it's not, while we have metrics to inform the decision, it isn't that when those three metrics are in some color, that's then the direction we're going to go. There is, we're interested in trend data, and we're trying to do moves that are best for our community, that does, number one, maximizes safety, but number two, maximizes learning under the what's most appropriate conditions. And I think that's the balancing act that we're trying to get in this with this, and then to make those transitions happen in a way that's that families and students and staff can manage in the least traumatic manner possible. Change is difficult, and so when we're talking about changing for 11,000 students and 12 to 1,300 staff members, and we make that decision on a Monday and saying, okay, we're going to change this for the following Monday, that's still pretty fast.
Dr. Cook, I got a question about the, in the appendix under B. Correct me if I'm interpreting this right. Some community members have been curious about the days that their students are not in school, so they would be doing their online work. The question varies depending whether it's an elementary parent or a high school parent. But for an elementary parent, the questions I've been hearing are, what can we expect? Is my child going to need assistance in navigating this, whatever the minimum expectation would be for learning that day, or is it something that they're doing independently? Are their teachers checking in with them? Can you talk to us a little bit more about what that would look like?
Yeah, we're getting that conversation or question quite a bit, like what do those criteria look like? And I think it's a both and. I think part of what we're trying to put out are clearly kind of separating, last spring, was pandemic learning, and that's definitely not what we're trying to deliver now. It's real school, and real school means that there are going to be expectations whether you're in person or you're at home. And how we manage that, I think, is going to vary to some extent by teacher, by level, by school for many of our students. But I do think that it's clearly there needs to be some more articulation on our part about what those expectations look like. If you recall, in the remote learning plan, we were very explicit with the fact that because a kid is at home on those 3 days doesn't mean their learning stops. Where we're running into trouble is some parents are asking us, well, tell me how many hours a day you want my kid online, and will they be interacting for those hours per day with their teachers directly, or will they be working on something at home? And I think that's some clarification. We're going to put some more messaging out here in the very near future to try to give some context around that. I just don't think that we've been clear enough with that. At the same time, we don't want to turn it into kids staring at their screen, watching a teacher for 7.5 hours a day. That's not the goal either. So look for some more clarification on that in the very near future.
Great. And then for secondary, what we're hearing from parents is accountability and, motivating a teenager if the parent's able to go to work, they're at home, it's their day, they're not in school. I was reading some of the Schoology information that you've sent to us, and there are ways that Schoology can make sure they're checking in, they're logging into their account. And I think there's a fair number of parents who want some accountability for our secondary students. Maybe you could speak to that a little bit. And then we haven't talked about grading at all, but that's starting to percolate again, especially for our secondary students. And in the framework, we haven't discussed grading anything yet, but I'm imagining if it's like school, there will be grades, especially for our secondary students. Could you just maybe touch on that?
Yeah, I think, I'll come back to the statement. It's real school, so there are going to be assignments, just like any classroom in any part of the U.S., there are going to be some assignments that aren't graded, that teachers are just doing check-ins with their students, but there are definitely going to be assignments that are graded. There are tools for both parents and teachers to see how much time and effort my students have put into this particular assignment, or watch this video, or they fast forwarded, watched 2 minutes of a 30-minute video and clicked speed up, those kinds of things. All that's available in real time. And I think we released earlier today the kind of training systems for our teachers to get caught up and start to get more comfortable with Schoology as a tool for learning. And so there will be a learning curve there with our staff, and we'll get much more effective once we get more comfortable with that and teachers actually have a chance to maneuver around in it. But I can assure you that teachers want kids to be accountable to the expectations, the standards that they're going to be expected to teach this year, and they want kids to be able to demonstrate their learning. So it's not going to be, if for whatever reason we wind up in orange or red this year, for a substantial amount of the year, that it's not going to turn into just gaps of time in which kids are not accountable for their learning.
Great, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Ms. May. On those transitions, any questions about that? From a logistical standpoint, we've scheduled these meetings for Mondays currently. We at least put them on the calendar every Monday. Would you envision it would take place on a Monday if we have a meeting to transition from one color to the next?
Yeah, when it comes to the most informed data we can get access to through our partnership with Kootenai Health and Panhandle Health District, that timeline really seems to align very well. And so I would anticipate when it comes time to start discussing that, unless something is a surprise, we would very much anticipate it happen on a Monday during a special board meeting that we would call, or that already was on the books.
Okay. Next document here is the collaboration time, and that's a new document for us this week if you want to address that one.
Yeah, so one of the things that very quickly became clear is, if you recall, we have collaboration time every Monday. We have late start Mondays, and teachers and building administrators use that time for quite a bit of planning and meetings and things that they do to help improve student learning. With orange, if we're in an orange category, half of the students attending in Monday, Tuesday, the other half attending in person on Thursday, Friday, made it very difficult for that to exist. And so we moved the collaboration time to Wednesday so that it aligned with those schedules, and when all students at that point would be in a virtual day for that Wednesday time. So what we would recommend, and what this document is sharing, is that at least for this year, and perhaps just this year, we would like to have permission to, if and when we would be in either a yellow or green scenario in which students are going to school 5 days a week, that we'd request that we had collaboration time on Wednesday mornings so that it aligned to that, so that there was continuity for staff, there was continuity for families that knew that Wednesday morning is that time in which students or that staff would be dealing with that, so that there isn't this change in approach, so that families would be burdened with this childcare on Mondays, but on Wednesdays if we're in orange, and it's just for the year, we just say it's Wednesday mornings, and then, assuming we're building a plan that applies for 1 year, then potentially readdressing that scenario for once we would go back to, I don't even want to say this word, whatever normal looks like once this is all run its course.
Do we offer a special School Plus program on Monday mornings currently or historically for those kind of late starts for folks who maybe need to get to work? And
We
so
do.
they went Monday only?
Yeah, we do, but it's limited, and we always have more demand than we can support. And I would venture that we would run into those same problems on Wednesday as well.
Okay, questions about that recommendation? None, okay. All right. So, next document's the fall athletic and extracurricular plan. And it's been maybe 2 weeks since we looked at this, I think, as a group, so. Any questions around that?
I guess my one question would be for you would be, does this, and I've read both the Idaho State standards and this plan, and I read the Idaho State standards. Do they match pretty consistently, or where are those spots where it kind of jogs and there's some differences?
They match fairly consistently.
Okay.
I'd say it may match closer to the federal standards, and what they did at the federal level is they had a 4-column model. And then Idaho adjusted that to try to make it to a 3-column model, and I think they would admit they maybe it didn't fit ideally into a 3-column model. So at times we looked at that national model there. And some of it was just kind of local decisions and what was our comfort level, and speaking with our advisors and Nicole and IHSA and those sorts of things on what can we do here to keep the ball moving and allow for gameplay and take extra precautions.
Okay.
I was curious on the cross country for yellow and orange. They both have a stagger start, and I was curious the reasoning behind that. You have a soccer game that lasts 90 minutes, and they're not staggered; they're shoulder to shoulder. Cross country starts last all of about 30 seconds, if that, and then they're spread out. I'm curious how you'd run a cross country meet, having attended many at high school level, staggered, and just the reasoning behind that.
I think on those kind of rules, we just went from the state recommendations. It was the appendices in the state recommendation. They were by sport. And my understanding is for those appendices, they took coaches and kind of said, what could we do to help mitigate risk? And so that was one that was come up by some group of coaches in the state, cross-country coaches or soccer and those sorts of things. So we didn't necessarily create those. We just moved those over from their plan. And not being a cross-country coach or parent, I couldn't tell you what that would look like.
It just seems like the risk associated with a football game and a cross country are a little bit different. And so who would we recommend we'd send feedback to with questions about the difference between the two? Is there a point person?
I mean, I would say either myself or Kelly Nichols. Really, Kelly's the chair, our director of secondary ed.
Okay.
So I would say to Kelly probably. And that committee is not scheduled to meet this week. I believe it's the following week for the next time. Okay. Any other questions on that?
No, they're just are they going to continue to increase the time where they can scrimmage each other? Is that what the kind of plan was, to start out there and then build up per half hour?
Yeah, so I think originally that was our plan a week or so ago. That's what we talked about, and you'd see that, or if you followed the practice protocols, we did increase minutes. At last week's meeting, Nicole Parkowski was there, our lead nurse, and she wasn't at the previous week's meeting. And I think just talking with her, she wanted to see the practice, the contact, kind of non-masking practice time dialed back a little bit. We know and recognize that gameplay is the most riskiest behavior as far as transmission would be concerned. And since we're allowing that we try to reduce risk of spread in practices, a little bit more. And so her recommendation is that we have less than 50% of practice time as contact time, even though we recognize that in a game situation, there's potentially contact 100% of the time, or there's the potential for it. So the coaches and the athletic directors on the committee were comfortable with that and felt that they could adequately practice and prepare under those protocols. So we actually reduced the minutes. It's works out to 14 minutes per half hour of practice time that they can be in contact or game simulations.
And then is that what they're considering the high intensity training? Sorry, I don't think my microphone was on. So that's what they're considering as high intensity training when they're kind of doing game-like scenarios?
Correct.
'Cause
And
there's
there was
other
some confusion around that.
high-intensity training that doesn't involve game-like scenarios with these other sports.
Right. So if they're not going to be a mass, they need to be socially distanced
During those.
during those. Or if they're not, then it would count as kind of that 14 minutes.
Okay.
So is the expectation that this is what's currently happening in our schools?
Yeah, that's the current practice protocol.
Yeah.
And who is responsible for enforcing these protocols?
Essentially, it would be coaches first and then athletic directors. And I assume if we still had issues with that, it would go to the building administrator and then chain of command.
So are these guidelines just for our district, or if we're traveling to Post Falls or another district, is this something that's been improved statewide, or is it just for our district?
No, so every district, the way the state decided to do it, like school reopening plans is, it's up to each local school board. And within our area, what we've essentially done is we have league games only, so Inland Empire League, so it's basically Lewiston to Sandpoint is our league. And each district has their own rules. And so the rules as far as the game site is the host team's rules. So, for instance, Lewiston, I believe, is in the green category right now. So if you were in Lewiston, there would be no restrictions for attendees or players. I think.
Yeah.
Right? I guess that's the way it is.
Yeah,
My
because they
un-
left
yeah.
it up to each district to
Right.
come up with their own, yeah.
And I know like Post Falls sent out kind of guidelines, hey, here's the expectations if you're coming to view a game at our site, and here's our player expectations. And I believe our athletic directors have done the same, and we'll be sending those out as they're hosting events.
So if we're sending our students to a district that might not be practicing the same protocols, do we worry that we could be putting them additional risk potentially as we move through fall if that was to develop? Whether it's just how they're sitting in stands and masking, or I don't know if that was discussed at the committee level.
We discussed protocol for,
Hold on, Kelly, we got to get you a little louder.
Let's jump
again.
let's get you in here.
sorry. Hi. So we discussed, just that it's the home game or the home team's rules. And so that's what the mandates are. But we would hope that our school sports teams will continue, at least on their sideline play, to follow the rules that we have. So spectators don't have to necessarily follow the enforcement of our district protocols, but we would want our players and coaching staff to follow our mandates or our regulations around gameplay, no matter what location they're in.
Thank you, Kelly. Okay, any other questions around that? And we've discussed, we'll be meeting regularly, that committee, and it's very much, somewhat of a wait and see model. And I think we all recognize that, and we kind of hope for the best, and much like school.
So Chair Morseau, if I read the room correctly and we're getting ready to shift, could I qualify a few things before we move on? Number 14 are the state guidelines. Those have not changed. Those have been approved by the governing board of the State Athletic Association. The communication plan, number 15, is ours, and that has no changes since last month. 16 is the defining levels of community spread, which was produced by the health districts across the state. They collaborated on that document back in the summertime to build that document. And it kind of became the precursor, if you will, to the work the work that we're using with the metrics. And then the last one is their guidance, the health district's guidance, number 17, that they wrote for how we would best achieve the safety goals that we would establish. And that came out of a collaborative effort with the health districts across the state. And then items 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23 are all documents built by our team, and specifically Nicole Piekarski, our lead nurse, on how best to keep folks safe in those procedures for things like how do we make sure kids are safe coming to school? If they're excluded from something, how do we get them back into school or back into the contest, for example? And so I would like us, if we have questions for any of those, I would like to do those as a bunch and have her up and available for you in that particular conversation. So.
Okay, so why don't we bring Nicole in on the big screen there? And I'll open it up for questions. So let's see, where are we, 18 through 23? I think Dr. Cook was assuming, well, we should talk about 15 if there's questions on 15.
Yeah,
first,
sure.
guess.
Yeah, I didn't mean
Okay.
to skip through. I just wanted to make sure that if we did have those questions, that we did that in that order.
All right. Ms. May, question on number 15?
No, I just wanted to thank the district. I guess I hadn't read it as closely, but in the news, recently there's been frustration by parents across the country about not being able to get data if there is a potential outbreak. So I just appreciated this document for its clarity and the commitment to making sure that we will get information out as quickly as we have it, and that we'll strive to make it as accurate as possible. So I just appreciate it, and I want to thank you.
And a lot of commitment, a lot of work in trying to provide transparent information and how we're managing the health of the community if in our role as the educators. And so we're definitely going to do our part.
There's been some frustration, I think, nationwide by parents not having access to that data, and we don't want that. We don't want anyone to have any more fear than they need. And so I think it's an important piece to getting parents and students feeling safe come fall.
And I would just add, there's that I would ask all of our families to pay attention and listen, because there's some fear out there that people are doing things and some rumors, and let's just pay attention, and if people have questions, send those to us directly and ask us rather than looking for their information on Facebook, please.
Okay, and we did, I believe it was at last week's meeting, might have been the one prior, we had an update around, maybe it was the one we did tonight, it was kind of a disclosure statement around FERPA and those sorts of things that basically allowed us to share information on a need-to-know basis if there were an infection. Obviously, if we need to inform somebody that they were sitting next to an infected person, that gives us those abilities. It doesn't mean we broadcast that name, on the PA system and in the newsletter, but okay. All right. Now are we ready to move down to 18 through 23 there and bring Nicole in? Okay. Do we have Nicole on?
Yes, I'm here.
Hi, Nicole.
Hello.
Okay, this is a lot of documents, so why don't we just, same thing here, just keep going. Let's just go through these one-on-one or one by one. So any questions on the first one's the daily home screening document? I've got a question on this one. So what's the expectation on this, or what's the vehicle for doing this? I recall at some point there was some talk about doing it through Skyward, and parents would have to log in or something and say, yeah, we did this, but
Yes, Chair Marisro, members of the board, Superintendent Cook, thank you for having me this evening. We are happy to work with Skyward in rolling out what we hope is a convenient app for parents to use to basically deny symptoms for their child each morning. So we would ask that parents would check in with their child in the morning before school and then access the Skyward app on their phone to quickly deny symptoms. We know that not all parents will be using this app, and so we'll also have to have other routes available for those students who were not screened before school for whatever reason, whether they forgot or they don't have access. But we're hoping to get a wide group of kids through the parent screening in the morning.
Well, I'm hopeful that you would get people to do that, but I just don't see that happening personally. Even in my own household, like going and remembering one more thing. And some kids, their parents aren't even there getting them off in the morning. So I just think that would be a big ask personally, to have people log in or do the app. And I'm just one person, but I would just hope in general that where we're at, that people just wouldn't send their kids to school sick or even go to work sick or anything. And so I'm just curious to see what other people think about that.
I was curious if you intended this for a certain age population. You know, middle schoolers and high schoolers can screen themselves for many of these symptoms. Are you wanting them maybe to have the app on their phone, and then as they're getting ready for school, or are you wanting parent involvement in this process?
What we would hope is that for those parents who want to have their children screen themselves, that the parent will just sign that the student can do that. And so, yes, if a student has, secondary student has their own device, we would ask, or we would take their assessment data just as well. And so we're hoping to get more kids screened that way. And we agree that many parents will not be able to do this for whatever reason, but it will help if we get even half the kids screened before they come to school.
So then did you say the other ones that aren't screened are going to get checked or something before they enter, or they're going to have to look them up? I mean, how would they do that, and who's checking when they enter the building? That just...
Well, you're right. We won't have a line outside of knowing who has been screened and who has not been screened. But we would make it our goal to run that report in the first hour of the day. And then as we know that these first few weeks of school will be a little bit more difficult to get into these new routines. And then from there, assess how well we're doing at this. And we probably will need to talk with schools and establish one entry to be used for students who still need screening, and reaching out and talking with those parents about how we can help them to get that screening done before school. The key factor being before we do this screening is making sure everyone knows these are the symptoms. Do not attend school, whether you're an employee or a student, when you're sick, please. And then after that, the screening. The CDC is recommending that parents would be doing the screening, and that schools not do routine screening of every student.
I wonder, just along the lines of Ms. Pickford, what she said, being the dad to 4 girls, I just know what it's like in our house, trying to get the kids out of school in the morning and get everyone ready and they're on time. And I just wonder about the accuracy and the effectiveness of this tool. And at some point, compliance may be very well initially or very good initially, but at some point it's going to become a checking of the boxes exercise. And I just don't know that's going to be viable data and would makes a whole lot of sense. I agree. I just wonder if we're asking too much to log in those sorts of things and acknowledge that you did it every day. And I wonder if we could have better results just through communicating that this is the expectation, these are the signs. We need you to be diligent about your students and, not sending them when they're sick. And I just wonder if that's going to be more effective or as effective, I guess.
On that same note, I had a question about liability, and Megan, maybe you could help us if, let's say we get these turned in and it's a little bit difficult at the beginning of the school year, and we get one that says sore throat and temperature, but we don't run a report till noon. So a child's in the classroom, from 8:30 to noon, we've missed it, but now we've documented it. Does that present a problem for us, having known that information? I just wonder if it has to be, if we're going to use it, it has to be a real-time feedback that it's clear and you can enter the facilities. Other schools are doing temperature screenings, but I wonder if this form, I think, is well-intentioned, but could it provide some liability for us if we're not checking them before school's actually starting?
If I could respond to that, I think Megan would have a valuable response as well, but I'd like to add that if a parent or a student is to enter that they have those symptoms, they would then be notified that they are not able to attend school that day, that they are excluded, and that they will be contacted for follow-up. So if a child did show up in the classroom after they had entered that data, it would be contrary to what they had been told to do.
Thank you, Trustee May. I think that's a... Can you hear me now? I wasn't actually aware of that the system would self-prompt and give an alert that a student is supposed to stay home. I think that's a great safeguard, because otherwise I do think that unfortunately we're in uncharted territory in terms of risks and liability. So certainly I think doing the home screening is in line with what CDC standards are recommending. And that's kind of our baseline of what we are using and advising the district on is, what is the baseline standard of care? CDC is what the national standard, and then the Panhandle Health District is our local standard. And certainly if we have a self-prompt where the student is told not to come to school and comes despite the fact, I think we have minimal risk. Certainly the district should endeavor to run these reports as early as possible. But we're not expected to be perfect for what that is worth.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Nicole, I didn't catch the self-prompt that it would come across the screen, do not attend school. So that does, I think that's a good.
This program will also, with the screening, and it's not perfect, as Megan has said, but it will assist the district so it looks like it will, through reporting with contact tracing, and will help us to quickly identify how many students in particular groups have symptoms that we may wish to follow up on.
So I just want to make sure I understand that. So it'll alert you, or you'll be able to tell, okay, we had 28 students from this school that said they had sore throats and fevers today. That's abnormal. We need to look a little deeper on that. Is that?
Yes, so really looking at how many students we're excluding for COVID-like symptoms, and then where are these students located in our buildings.
Okay, other questions around that or comments?
I wonder, Dr. Cook, if we could assist parents that are rushing out the door and don't get it done, if we could have some iPads. I know that's another infectious piece, but an area, in the vestibule where they could quick do their form, fill it out, and submit it. If you're just allowing opportunities for students that might not have a device readily available.
Yeah, we've talked about this actually quite a bit. Just the volume is the biggest challenge, and I think what we're trying to do is to turn this into something that is immanageable into something that's reasonably manageable. And I think if we were to even get 90% compliance, that's still over 1,000 kids that we're going to have to find a way to get checked relatively quickly, spread out on our 17 schools that I think, and I think that would be a 90% goal. I think we would probably be pretty happy with. And so we do anticipate that that's going to be something that is going to be at least a logistical issue for us to address. And I think whether we're planning for it or not, there are going to be people needing those opportunities as they walk in the school, and it arguably would become a new part of their day. So I fully expect there to be something like that existing at our school.
Can you speak to just the personnel behind how that would happen then? I mean, that seems like that's a whole new piece. And so what kind of ways are we gonna handle polling kids and screening them and that type of thing?
Nicole, do you want to jump in what you guys have talked about, what that might look like as we try to fill in those gaps and those groups of kids that we would have to go seek out?
Yeah, as part of that conversation, I would like to share that we have had many schools that the teachers are interested in helping with this, and part of that is, I believe, a felt safety for our employees who really do want to see screening happen. But then when we look at the recommendations and then we look at the practicalities of that happening, that is a daunting task to think about getting through all of those kids. So we really have talked about what it would look like to run that report within the first hour of the day, combined with talking with our attendance secretaries and knowing who's in for A day and B day. We're really talking about half of our students on campus when we're in orange, so that number is going to be cut in half further, and then tag teaming that with a couple of people, and it might be more than a couple of people if the school is bigger, but we do know that we have thermometers that are ready to go out. We've got 87 new thermometers that will be in our buildings, and then other buildings have also purchased additional thermometers. So we're hoping that this is going to get just real quick and slick for follow-up, and we'll adjust as needed. So, plan, do, study, act type of thing, and quickly adjust to get better and more efficient each week.
Nicole, did the CDC make some changes around the temperature screening recommendation? I thought from sports committee they had kind of eliminated that or talked about that. It wasn't a very reliable.
What we do know for children is that 96% or so, the numbers I looked at last, we know the science is changing as we learn more, but that 96% of children with COVID do develop a fever at some point. It may not be their first symptom. However, temperature is a reliable indicator that there is an infectious process going on. And so while not everyone with COVID-19 has a fever, it is a quick, easy way to screen and is reliable for infectious process. So it's still a good indicator. And I am not aware of any changes with temperature.
Were you meaning when they discussed how sometimes kids run warmer? I remember reading something to that effect, or maybe it was a parent email that we got in regards to, I think it was a Down syndrome child.
Well, I will say that certainly if a child has been, say, running in PE and they have a sweatshirt on and their cheeks are red and we take their temperature and it's elevated, as a nurse, I can make further assessments to gather more details, and that might even include waiting 10 minutes and taking the sweatshirt off and letting a child sit down. So what we would hope is that any child at any point during the day, if they are identified as having symptoms of an illness, that we would be able to have, at least by phone, a nurse talking over some of what those symptoms might be, if there's any question to that, if that helps with temperature.
Okay. This one will be interesting. It wouldn't shock me if we were revisiting this in a few weeks because we're having 20% compliance or 20% doing it. And I don't know.
Yeah, I agree. I just picture too some of the students that are like, oh, filling it out themselves. Check, check, check. Oh, this is telling me I'm I can't go to school today, you know, just, kids just do things, or, as you, silly like that, you know what I'm saying? Just to, I mean, I was a kid once too, I'd be like, maybe I have a fever today, I don't know. I just, you would hope that they would fill it out properly, but yeah, I definitely think we'll probably be revisiting this. I'm hopeful that people would go on there, but I just think it's just one more thing.
And I would just agree that at this point, we don't know how well some of this will be received because there isn't a playbook for it. And so I think it's a great starting place, and we do anticipate that once our reopening plan is approved by you guys, that we will be likely bringing things back for further discussion as we run into issues with them, and perhaps this is one of those. And we would just ask that you guys kind of bear with us as we build the system while we're delivering the system. So just be prepared. I anticipate we'll be talking about the reopening plan and modifications to it for quite some time.
Okay. So next document's a return to school or play document. Any questions on this? Fairly straightforward. Okay, hearing none, I'm going to move on. Just try to keep us in our 2-hour time window here. Next document's something very similar about contract tracing and kind of a workflow on that. Questions on that document? Okay. Next document, I'm on 19, I believe. It's, so we're at 21, excuse me. And this is about isolation and quarantine guidelines. Questions on this document?
I had a couple questions. This document's obviously complex, and I think the part of it that gives me a little bit of heartburn and worry is our asymptomatic students who have an exposure, get tested, test positive, and then we're still asking them to quarantine when they feel fine. And is it a firm 14-day quarantine? I was just kind of reading through. So they have an exposure, they're asymptomatic, they test positive, and even though they feel fine, it's 14 days from their exposure or their positive test.
For someone who tests positive, it should be 10 days from their positive test. And those individuals who are asymptomatic, that's the direction that they would receive, 10 days from the test. Individuals who were symptomatic and then tested positive would go 10 days from development of symptoms as a minimum time frame for isolation.
And so for our students that are in a classroom, there's a positive test, they get tested, we're going to have them wait between 4 and 5 days to get tested, get their test, and then if it's positive and they're still asymptomatic, then you kind of get to that 14-day. It's just a lot of waiting, and I think for parents it could potentially be frustrating that we're telling them to wait to get tested because we know it's more accurate from their exposure, and then waiting again even though their student may feel fine. I just wondered if you could speak to that and the importance of why the CDC has put these guidelines in place.
So I think it would be important to note that the scenario that you're talking about, I think, is if we have a positive in a classroom, we have a group of students who are going to be asked to quarantine for 14 days because they have had a known contact with a positive. It would be important for those families to know that if they get tested or if they do not get tested, those 14 days will still be adhered to. So if they were to get tested and be negative, we would still ask them to complete those 14 days of quarantine. The 5 to 8 days is what's recommended to wait after the exposure, a minimum of 5 to 8 days, so that the viral load is high enough that we would be able to pick up on that in the testing. But if that child were to get tested and they're negative, they would still have to complete that 14-day quarantine.
Yeah, it's just a long time, I think it really just highlights the importance of minimizing exposures for our students, because minimum, we're looking at 14 days based on the CDC guidelines that they're going to be out of the classroom. And so it gives you pause. It makes you consider, multiple exposures in 1 year could be a month without school, which would be difficult.
Nicole,
Yes, it is a long time frame.
Nicole, could you kind of talk to what exposure maybe means? And is that I'm just sitting next to another student, or what is exposure? What qualifies exposure?
So the big defining piece for exposure that we're looking for is if you are in, or students are within 6 feet of each other for longer than 15 minutes. And this time frame and this space is not changed when there are barriers like plexiglass in place, or other measures that we know are helping to decrease the risk, but it doesn't change the time frame. So that's the big one, is 6 feet for 15 minutes. But in addition to that, close contact is also considered any touching. If someone were to get respiratory droplets on another person in any way. So if you're walking in the grocery store and someone sneezes on you, that's considered a close contact, even though it was for less than a few minutes. Sharing the same eating utensils as well is considered close contact. So we would be trying to prevent our students from sharing eating utensils. We want them to space out so that they are not coughing and sneezing on each other. And when they do encounter each other closer than 6 feet, we want to keep that time frame to less than 15 minutes.
I know I've asked this question, I feel like 100 times, but around the 15 minutes, it's just, everyone's so non-specific on that. So in a school day, and I'm going to use elementary as an example. So you have a class of 3rd graders. Is that 15 minutes in the school day, 15 consecutive minutes, 15 minutes in an hour?
And this does seem to be getting a different type of answer, kind of, sort of, depending on who you ask, because we are using 15 minutes as a hard line, but we know that if you're in a shared space, an enclosed space with higher numbers of people throughout the day, even if it's only, so let me say this, if you are spaced out 6 feet, but you are in the same room for 6 hours, that is an increased risk. So we are looking for that defining moment of 6 feet for 15 consecutive minutes. However, everyone should know that the risk increases the more times you encounter each other. So we will be looking at each case individually in the school district with the guidance and collaboration of the Panhandle Health Department, because sometimes we're going to be very confident about who those close encounters are, and other times we'll be more concerned because maybe an individual was asymptomatic and in our building for a long time during the day.
To me, this is just one that's going to be very complicated. I guess it'll be interesting to see how it works. But my concern is that we end up with a large number of students that have been asked to quarantine when they didn't need to. And, how do we prevent that and balance, the caution and the protection versus the risk of having students out. And we all know this, but that's going to be a big challenge. And you look at a secondary school where, high school where kids are going to be changing classrooms, you could, one student who tests positive could impact, if you're just talking their neighbors sitting around them, 20 kids, really quickly, if not more. So.
My question kind of piggybacks on Chair Morris-Rose. And so if we have the asymptomatic student in a classroom and it's greater than 15 minutes and students need to then sit out for their 14 or 10 days, whatever it may be, how will you guys monitor those students if they're feeling well and they show back up at school? Is it the teacher's responsibility? Because I can see that also being difficult for many of our independent young adults that feel fine and don't quite understand what kind of system is in place for that scenario.
We will be indicating to the attendance secretary which children are excluded and for what time frame, and then we will have that data in a spreadsheet, and we'll be contacting those students and employees 48 hours prior to their expected return and inquiring about their symptoms, if they've had a fever, if they're getting better. And so we're hoping that because of that 48-hour time frame, we're going to have a pretty good kind of heads up about where these students are at. And then when the student does return to school, we will the school nurse will personally follow up with those students just to confirm that things haven't changed for them.
I was more imagining a scenario where the student comes back after, say, 3 or 4 days and decides, I'm all right, you know, I don't want to miss any more school. This is difficult.
And we will have that student on our list of not able to attend school right now. And so we would follow up by putting that student in a excluded area where they'll be safe and monitored until they can get a ride home or contact their parent for their transportation home.
Dr. Cook, I think one question I have off of that then is if I'm a student and I've been sent home and I'm quarantining, what does education look like for that student?
I think
At that point.
if we assume that the student is healthy, then the student would be able to participate remotely and try to access their classes through Schoology and through the learning management system, and teachers would then hopefully be able to deliver services to that student in that remote setting. It's a little different than the system being blended. We anticipate, if this goes well, then we don't have too many times that this happens. But in the instances in which it does, then those students would be participating for those, 14 or so days remotely and have full access to their learning in that time.
I do worry they won't be getting true learning hours, unless we're finding a way that we can video our lectures and they could be watching along at home. I think that would be a long time to have. Since they're not enrolled in eSchool,
Yeah.
It would be a difficult stretch, especially for our secondary students who are covering a lot of material in a short amount of time. Is that something that we could ask our secondary students potentially, or teachers, just to provide some sort of live streaming so those students that are waiting their quarantine time can still be
Well,
learning?
Schoology has that technology available to it where teachers could upload videos. I think, the question on whether or not we're just going to push play or record and have a camera in the back of the room. We will be putting cameras and have those available for teachers, but at the same time, whether or not it's going to just be I'm watching a screen and a teacher walks by every now and then as they are talking, those we will provide them as best we can, and teachers will have to manage that as best they can.
Do you think it's something as we move forward, and this is going to be something that evolves, that if we have a large number of students that we're able to provide something for those families, especially at a secondary level, so they're not falling behind? I think it would be really essential, whether they can jump into eSchool or what it may be. But 2 weeks would be a long time to be sitting on the sidelines.
I think that's a unique and interesting conversation. I think right now eSchool is we're building it as a school that stands alone with the students that have enrolled in that, and being able to access those courses would be pretty substantially different. And I think it would, it's just, I think back to students that, maybe got mono or something, and how they managed, the one part that's going to be significantly different with this is that we might have students at home healthy that are just looking for ways to stay connected to their classes. And I think that'll be a new and different challenge for us. And we're just going to have to learn as we go and do the best we can to keep those kids engaged and keep them working on the material just like any other student.
I think the risk you run, compared to a situation like monos, you're not talking, onesie twosie in a school year. You potentially could have dozens of students or hundreds of students in a quarantine situation.
I think and maybe we did this out of order, but I think the next part I'm assuming we're going to talk about is cohorting, and the fact that our goal is always, how do you minimize this? If a positive case enters the school, and maybe I shouldn't say if, or should say when, that the goal is to try to keep it the impact of that positive case as small as possible, because it really is a challenge, and quite frankly, students could be exposed, and then that amount of time is just time that they are no longer being able to attend in school, and that's just the kind of the direct and difficult solution that is before us on this. And so how do we then maximize their opportunity at home so that it isn't just lost time? 14 days is a lot of days.
Yeah, 14 is a lot of days, but I see it as if we're in how we're starting out in the blended and they're going the 2 days in person, they would still be they would just be missing those 2 days or 4 if we're doing the 14 days, the 2 weeks. So they would still be accessing, hopefully if they're feeling well and able to, the, school where they're doing online or virtual, the other 3. So, that would be.
Yeah, we're getting a little bit of a taste of that by opening in Orange, right? We're getting that, how do you manage both in learning or in-house, in face-to-face, in-school instruction, teaching and learning for the staff, and then also blended. So I think it's definitely going to be the closest to that example that we would have is that early start in Orange.
We've talked primarily around students in this regard, but this would apply to staff members as well. With some potential, there's some changes going on there. Can you talk a little about that?
So right now, I would have to tell you that health-wise, we don't want anybody to get sick, of course, but a quarantining for an exposure of one of the teachers being, or a building principal, or is also a substantial loss. And if we had a teacher who, at secondary school, some teachers see 150, 180 kids a day. And if we have to quarantine a teacher, that could be a challenge. And then what does that look like? And especially if the teacher is unhealthy or feels ill, then you put a sub in that position and you work it through. But if a teacher is quarantining and feels fine, we'll go back to our original discussion about our policies, emergency policies that we put in place, which theoretically, if certain parts of this would allow them to work from home, if we could establish a way in which they could do that, then maybe we don't have to have such an environment where we obviously would have to have an adult in the classroom, but teachers might still be able to stay contacted or connected to their kids. We got guidance last week from the federal government that teachers and educators are likely to be named critical workforce, essential staff, which could potentially allow us to have some flexibility. We'll have to dig into that a little further. Instead of a teacher, for example, needing to be quarantined for 14 days when they're asymptomatic, it would give us the potential of building some policies that would allow them to come back under different scenarios, maybe a little bit sooner than the 14 days. So we're going to be digging into that and see how those changes might be a part of this as well.
Yeah.
And I should state one more time that was in regards to asymptomatic staff that would be quarantined.
Yeah, I had a video conference last week with Debbie Critchfield, the board chair from State Department of Ed, and this is one topic they're looking at as a state and are concerned about, and investigating those rules. It's where those rules are found is healthcare and first responders and those sorts of things that after a certain number of days and a negative test, they can come back. You're not home 14 days if you're asymptomatic. So I think that's what the state's looking at as well, and some guidance around that.
I thought it was interesting on those comments, we're listing off first responders, healthcare workers. They're all wearing full PPE. So I think it's something to consider, but in the same vein, they are very different situations. And our teachers didn't sign up to be first responders. They signed up to be teachers. And so remembering, keeping them in the forefront of our mind, I think is important.
Next document here is the infection control plan.
I would just add that the infection control plan was a specific request from the health district. This information was kind of interwoven throughout the plan. They asked us specifically to call this out directly.
Yeah, a lot of this information we've covered just in our conversations tonight and in other parts of the document and past conversations. Questions about this document? Okay. I'm going to move on to cohorting then. And this cohorting document is part of the appendices, is that correct? Because we also have cohorting where we're talking about it as an information item later in the meeting, or are we kind of blending those two?
So that's correct. So there's two parts we're talking about here. Cohorting as a strategy of the reopening plan, and then talking about it a little bit, kind of prefacing conversations that I think we're going to be having here in the very near future about what does it look like to cohort in the Coeur d'Alene School District to try to minimize impact, and how we can kind of stage that conversation. The three that we keep hearing questions about the most were, number one, and I think we've got those in the update, so I want to make sure we're clarifying, is what does contact tracing look like as a conversation? What about cohorting, and what does it look like? Because there's really two different strategies, one that can be employed across the elementary school, and then one that quite arguably I think we're recommending be a little less restrictive, deployed at the secondary schools because of the variety of different access points that students need. And those kind of come at a cost. When you provide students those opportunities, then there's a risk that cohorting becomes less controllable. And if we say every kid at the elementary school, for example, can go out on the playground and play together, when it comes back to a positive case and contact tracing, then effectively what you've done is intermingled all those students together, and we might have to pull every single student out of that school and quarantine them. But by controlling the access kids have to other groups of kids, you can minimize that kind of stuff. So that's part of what the difference between this document and I think the conversation that we're getting ready to at least start the beginnings of tonight later on. So, Nicole, do you want to jump in on any of that?
I agree with you. I think that's great.
Okay, so any questions on the document? Not the conversation we're going to have around that later.
The one question I had, Dr. Cook, about the cohorting is when we talk about pushing in and, our art, music, PE teachers, I think about them particularly because they're going to be exposed to so many students in one day. And Nicole, you might be able to weigh in on this. Just the risk involved in that, and I know there's no other way if we're going to be cohorting at an elementary level that we want kids to stay in their classroom, but I do wonder about the exposure for those teachers that will be rotating essentially to every student in the entire school.
Yeah, that's it's the right conversation. I think the difficult part about this and their role as a specialist, whether that's music or art or ALP for that matter, they're contacting many students daily anyway, and so rather than having exposure for all, if we're going to continue to offer those programs, now we've limited the exposure, and then we've only got one person to really worry about all those other things that we can control a little better, because the adult knows that we've got to use our barriers best we can, we social distance as best we can, we wash our hands a lot, those kinds of things. It gives us a less variability in that. It doesn't minimize the fact that they're I don't want to say exposed, that they're in front of many different kids during the day, but it gives us a little better opportunity to control those options when they happen. Nicole?
Yeah, and I agree with what you're saying there, and would like to add that for the first time, we're really seeing some organized written guidelines for music, choir, and performing arts teachers from the CDC. They just last week updated their back to school guidelines again, and we've got some good considerations in here to say that we're headed in the right direction on how to protect our staff. And there's some suggestions here where we may want to consider with more importance the placement of physical barriers, a little bit stronger presence in these areas instead of just maybe some some possibilities where we've talked about it in other areas of our schools.
Well, that's great news. Thank you for sharing that.
In regards to the document, the only question I had, and it's under the what is cohorting, and it'd be the third bullet, but is just a statement, limit mixing between groups. And that's just such a broad statement, right? My limit might be different than your limit. And I just wonder, what does that look like? And I think at some point we need to really define what those expectations are, whether it's at secondary or elementary. At the elementary level, I'm concerned let's not make it prison. And, we don't want kids to hate school or dread coming to school because they're, locked in this room and, they can't go to the bathroom or can't, they're there all the time. That we have to balance that a little bit with, what we know about risk for students in an elementary age and all those sorts of things.
So without going too far down the rabbit hole, I'm going to ask Kate Orozco to jump on a little bit here and just talk about some of the conversations that we've been having at the elementary administrator level about those very things, this applies, quite honestly, it's going to be different at secondary than it is at elementary school, but just the kinds of questions and the conversations that elementary administrators are having specifically to these kinds of questions. Like, for example, do you let kids go out and just have play with any kid they chose to play with in a recess type environment? That then changes who would then potentially be impacted when they come back in. So I think that's part of the discussion. So Kate, if you could jump in for a second, I'd love to.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that as our elementary team has really started to unpack the reopening plan and all the implications for cohorting and safety, I keep coming back to thank you for this extra week. Because goodness, there's a lot of information that we're trying to assimilate. So how the difficulty, I think, Casey, I feel like you mentioned some of the nuances that we're trying to figure out, and that is keeping our kids together and keeping them in a cohort and reducing contact with other kids in the school. We believe will do exactly what Nicole said. It will help us if we have to start talking about quarantining where there's a positive case. It will reduce the overall impact to the school. And the difficulty comes when we start thinking about the little nuances, like do we keep the kids in the classroom? And we've kind of settled on that probably for lunch, for instance, and we know that that's probably a good idea. Ed has helped us kind of broaden that a little bit, Ed Ducar, by saying we could fit some kids in the lunchroom if we spread them out and if we made spaces, and we could fit some kids outside and some kids in the gym. How careful do we have to be about playground equipment? And that. In fact, I just read today. I think 3 different emails coming to me about that, and I, of course, dutifully sent them on to Nicole to help us figure that out. But I think that what our principals are doing are deciding what's loose and what's tight. Where can we have some loose boundary, and where do we need to be tight and consistent among schools? For instance, I think I saw the document. They're keeping track of all their thinking and all of their problem solving together. And I noticed they said we're going to hold hands on the fact that teachers will need to take their kids out to recess, and we'll need to really teach them all the different ways that you can play and have fun and do a lot of exercise, but maybe not be hugging each other, right? And not be, and with littles, what that's like. So there's a tremendous amount of work that we're trying to do. We're working bit by bit, just trying to really come up with solutions that will still maintain a sense of joy and community in our classrooms and in our schools, because you all know it's been a long time since our our little people have been together, and they long for that. And so so we'll just keep tackling one issue after the next, and we're turning a lot to Nicole and our team and our COVID team to help us find some answers to some of these sticky ones. Bathrooms, that was a big deal. How much do you have to supervise kinders in the bathroom to make sure that they're social distancing? That's a good question.
As we work through that, I just hope we evaluate it like we have sports, right? We've taken some risk with sports, if you will, with the understanding it's a limited group and it's outdoors, and the risk of transmission is less likely outdoors. I think it's less likely through contact of physical objects, door handles, those sorts of things. In that, maybe we look at, recess as that may be their only chance to kind of let loose a little bit, especially if we're masking or we're in yellow and we have full classrooms. So the masking is going to be a lot, right? You're going to have less opportunity to social distance when we have in a yellow scenario where we have our buildings full 5 days a week. So. Again, it's just another one of those that we need to balance out and weigh out.
I think, Casey, I think that the entire elementary administrative team would agree with you there that it's so critical we find a balance between how do we keep our kids completely safe and how do we still let them be kids.
I think one thing that's important there, and you know this, but even through our exercise with sports, is consistency, and that things look the same building to building, because you don't want to get the well, why do we have, why do they get to do this and we don't, kind of a thing. Just that we really emphasize that consistency across the district. Okay. Any other questions around the cohorting document? All right. I think this is the last appendices, the COVID risk category document. And we talked about this a little bit earlier. We got the latest version of it here on our dais in front of us. And definitely trending in the right direction.
Yeah, this is at least a little bit of good news, I think. We're seeing a decrease in both incidence rate and percent positivity on, and if you recall, we kind of established 3 criteria as the ones that would be our most interested. Incidence rate, which is the number of new cases that happen normalized to a population of 100,000, and we're trying to get that data for, right now we'd love to have it just for our school district. Unfortunately, we have to use all of Kootenai County for that data metric. The second one is the percent positivity, which, if you recall, is the percentage of folks tested that wind up as a positive case, that there's a correlation between the higher the positive rate of tests that happen, the more indicative of spread that is currently going on. And then the last one is really a joint, it's 2 things. It's the number of hospitalizations and those that are hospitalized that are in intensive care. And we're kind of building this data kind of dashboard, if you will, that looks at those 3 things and kind of gives some relative rating to them based upon what those metrics are, and then we make a decision based upon that. I will say that is not the same thing as the colors that Panhandle Health is necessarily putting out of what's going on. They're similar, but they are not the same thing, and I think that's the important part about this. And I would remind you once again of your authority, is that these decisions for what category we would be going into, you guys maintain and hold that authority, and we would ask Panhandle Health District and potentially Kootenai Health as advisories to give us feedback on current status and where these things are and how that information could then be used to make the most educated decision. And if you recall, our recommendation last week was that we just take a little bit of time and we ask for the blended model, orange, to be the beginning of school, and let's start off in that. So the good news is it appears that this last data set that came in essentially kind of hot off the presses earlier today would indicate that we, at least for 1 week, the 7-day rolling averages were down. And so that's, in my opinion, that's very good news for what we, if the goal is, number one, to keep our community safe, that's data that would indicate we're trending in the right direction and would also lend itself to us being able to potentially move into a different category sooner rather than later.
Okay. Any questions about the document? We spent quite a bit of time on this last, I think, was that last week we saw it for the first time, I believe?
Yes.
A week and a half ago.
Dr. Cook, I was just curious, as you guys are receiving recommendations from Panhandle, and first, thank you for these metrics, and thank you to Panhandle and Kootenai for collaborating with the district to create them. They're fantastic, and I think they'll be a great resource for us as we move through fall and into winter. When you guys are making a decision and you're ready to present to the board that we will transition to a new level potentially, is it all metrics must be met, or is it potential that you'll use one metric, or imagine how that, or kind of give us details on what that might look like?
Yeah, so this is not fail-safe for sure, and I would tell you that the one, and all of the data points aren't equivalent, quite frankly, in my opinion. I think it's important to note, number one, that incidence rate is probably a more primary data point. Incidence rate should be arguably a little bit more important. It's also one that we feel like we at least can see a pretty good picture of what's going on in Kootenai County. The percent positivity, we actually give it to you in this form 2 different ways. We give it to you from the lens of what's percent positivity at Kootenai Health. And then also you have the graph that looks like this one. That's actually off of Panhandle Health District's website. That is the percent positivity of all of the 5 northern counties that collect that data across the entire region. And it actually goes to the state, and then the state sends it back to the respective health districts. So there's a little bit of lag in time on that. So you might see there's a little bit of discrepancy between these 2 data sets. If you see, I think Kootenai Health reported a percent positivity of 6.3% in the last data point, and the last of for all of the Panhandle Health District is 11.2%. So there's definitely some variability there, and I think that's one of the things that we want to keep in mind. And I think the third one that is really important is, hospitalizations. If we are in a situation in which the hospital becomes inundated or overwhelmed with cases, I think that's going to be a factor unto itself. And so I think this is going to be useful as a tool and help us make quality decisions, but I would also be cautious not to assume that if one is in the red, we're all in the red, or if one is in the yellow, we're all in the yellow, but using this as really giving us a better idea of what's trending. This is based in some stuff that's being used nationally. It's been tweaked a little bit across the system, but I think that we're going to learn more about this as a tool for how we use it as we use it too.
Yeah, I think that was my comment. I agree that incidence is probably one of our best guides to how what we're seeing as far as spread in the community. The one metric that gave me a little pause is our positivity rate, and when we're still moderate at a 20% positivity, that gave me a little pause, I have to be honest. And you can watch the Panhandle graph. When we were back mid-July at 12.52, the hospital was feeling the pinch, and our community was seeing more cases. They kind of go in lockstep positivity with new cases. And so are these metrics something that, as we progress through fall, that if we realize 20% is high and it puts stress on our medical system, that we could evaluate, 10% across the country and 5% for schools is kind of what we're seeing as a norm when they feel comfortable for students being in the classroom. And so the 20% seemed a little bit aggressive, to be honest. And if there's something that we can kind of reevaluate every month and see how they're lining up to what we're seeing in our community, I think that would be helpful.
Yeah, so I would just, I think what I would ask is that the modeling of how we're looking at this data be really kind of the point at which we're talking about it now. Those gating criteria, those numbers, those thresholds actually came to us from recommendations with conversations with the health district. And so I would, and they're always glad to have those conversations with us. I think if somebody is, I think for me, there's two parts. And the first is, does this model of looking at the data and doing those analyses work for the board? And secondly, we can continue to talk with them if we feel like, or if you guys are suggesting that there's possibility that the thresholds are too high, too low, those kinds of things. That's to me, those are two different conversations. But I think ultimately, when we ask for your approval of this, it isn't necessarily in support of every little detail on it, but the concept itself of using this as an informational tool for helping making those decisions.
Yeah, and I think as we move towards fall and flu season begins in earnest, it's something that, yeah, we may need to come back and circle our wagons and say positivity rate of 20% in addition to flu could be a heavy load for everybody in the community, so it'd be something to talk about and keep mindful of.
Yeah, I think important to remember this is our data points, right? I mean, they came to us from Panhandle Health or in development with Panhandle and Kootenai, but these are used for our guidance because ultimately it's our decision what level we're in. So I think we certainly have the opportunity, the authority to look at these if we feel tweaking's necessary. I think also it's important in Ms. May, you talked about, is this the only data point? But one I think about is, you could be in green, let's say for cases, and it could be, I don't know, let's say there was 100 cases in the previous 7 days in Kootenai County, and you say, wow, that's really good. But if 65 of them were our students, we'd probably have a different outlook, right? And so why the data is great, there's a story behind it too, and we'll have to be aware of that. And there's going to be those situations where there could be influence. Same thing. It could be the data may not look good, but if there was an outbreak north of town, outside of our district boundary, then we may say, okay, we need to exercise caution here, but maybe we don't need to go from 100 to 0. So
I think what I like about it, and I would echo Ms. May's comments about just appreciating the document and the work and the collaboration that's happened. But there's a lot of documents involved with our reopening plan, but if I, as a parent, want some answers of how is it that we got to the decision of green, yellow, orange, this is the document to look at. And this breaks it down simply, very easy to read and understand. And while some of the there may be arguments behind maybe some of the metrics. I feel confident in the fact that we have collaborated with Kootenai Health and Panhandle, and they have, for lack of a better phrase, given this their blessing. And this is the document that at least we're working under for now. And I appreciate all that work. And I think if parents have questions about why are we in orange and where did we come up with that, if you look at the numbers last week, that's where we came up with them. If you look at the numbers this week, and had we decided this week, it may have been a different story. And I don't think that is lost on anybody. And I just want parents to understand that this group of people have thought a lot about these 5, but in addition to the superintendent and administration, have thought a lot about parents and the implications on parents. And the reality is there had to be a breaking point to make a decision for all families to start planning. And at the point we made that choice, we were in orange. And things may change considerably in the next 2 weeks. But we're planning for orange. We're going to open in orange. And if parents can be prepared, if we can make then a transition as we trend down more to something that may be an easier transition than going from green into orange. And a lot of parents commented over the week about, does this board even think about them? Does this board even care about the implications? And I can tell you personally, and from my conversations with others, this board does care. It does care about parents. It does care about the implications, and this was not an easy decision, not an easy recommendation, and I just wanted to share that sentiment. And if you have questions about where we got this, it is coming from people who are educated in the medical field and understand what we're dealing with and have given that recommendation to this board, and we followed that. And one other note, based on my own career, liability is an issue that this board has to consider. And if this board decides that with Panhandle Health telling us where we need to be and Kootenai Health telling us where we need to be, and we throw that aside and ignore that, and kids get sick or teachers die, then that becomes a liability to this district. So I hope in my recitation of those things from a personal level, that there can be a better understanding of why we're doing what we're doing. And we really do care about everybody in this community. I will get off my soapbox.
Thank you, Ms. Rumley. You highlighted, I kind of had two comments or questions on this in the discussion around this. And one is just on that opening. We made a decision last week to open in Orange. And I'd like us to at least acknowledge that is our decision. And for at least the first week or the first few weeks, we're going to be in Orange, kind of regardless of what this data says to some degree. And I think it's important that people understand that, and that is crystal clear to our families. The last thing I want is someone to see, data and say, okay, it's yellow, they're going to be 5 days a week, and I don't need to worry about childcare. I don't need to worry about this or that. In that it's crystal clear that that's what we're going to be. In the same token, I think it's important if the data trends the way it does, and I know there's agreement here that if we have the ability to shift to yellow, that we do that as quickly as possible. Can you maybe explain a little bit why we want to open in Orange, besides the data, and what, how that helps staff and planning and kind of operations?
Yeah, so there's very strong rationale for why the hybrid model makes the most sense as the starting point. For all the reasons we've talked about, when we have students that are quarantined, when we talk about the nimbleness and the flexibility that we're going to expect for families and parents and students to be living in. We've talked about the fact that we would be changing potentially in a single week, going from one category to another. All of those factors lean in. We know we can do green. We've been doing green for years, and we've been doing it really well. And we at least know what comes with red from what we did last spring, and we know we can do red we can do it now even better based upon the supports we've put into place and the training we're doing right now. And so the biggest challenge is really how do you deal with this kind of blended model? And quite frankly, if we were to start, for example, in yellow and then switch to a hybrid, all those things that you're hearing us talking about that are very real conversations and very demanding and very detailed, those are going to hit the second that we make that change. And so let's start slow, let's start well, let's make sure that people are prepared, and let's enter into Orange and get some of those bugs worked out and get it figured out so that we can take advantage of our new learning management system. We can present the case for how we can handle school in any category at that point, and then let's figure out from there. And so, the data, let's not remember this, there's not a playbook for school in a pandemic. I'm very excited to see that data point come in with less risk, and I would hope that it stays that way. But that's also 1 week's worth of data, so let's not get too quick on what might be coming next. There's still a holiday involved, and the last major holiday we had was July 4th, and we saw a significant spike in just a couple of weeks after that. And right now, we don't know if that's going to happen. We do know that NIC started back to school today. We know that other districts are starting back next week. And so, we don't have control of all of our own destiny on this. These criteria are built for Kootenai County and North Idaho. And so part of that is how do we manage knowing what's going on in our community from a public health perspective. So for those reasons, we felt like Orange makes the most sense as a starting place.
Okay, so with that in mind, is it appropriate just to have a little discussion about when we may look at changing, or is it just, we don't know that and it's too early, but I'm just thinking, like, if it's not going to be until October, or it's not going to be whatever it is, that it would be nice to prepare that. Maybe we don't know that, but I think at some point we should have that discussion, so there's, that ability to plan for our parents. That's part of the reason we made the decision last week. I'm assuming it's at least a few weeks we would operate in the Orange, at least 2 weeks, right? 3 weeks, whether it's the month of September or something, but.
Dr. Cook, I was wondering if that's something that we could add to those metrics. A lot of the models that I think Panhandle and Kootenai, the Harvard model from one that we've been talking about, give a recommendation for the amount of minimum time to spend. As your numbers improve, how long do you have to maintain those numbers to really substantiate making a move? If we could get some recommendation on that. I know Oregon's using 3 weeks at metrics that they've achieved before they make that move, but it would be nice to have some guidance from Panhandle or Kootenai on what they would recommend.
I think we can probably collect what others are doing, and I'm not sure that that Panhandle Health is going to be the source of that information. I think what would be better is for us to look at what are the other states, what are those guidances looking like across the states. Just as we talk about the importance of transitioning from category well to very well, the idea of switching and then realizing very quickly after we switched that it was a mistake and that the data is telling us we should go back. We fully expect, while there's not tons of research on that, we fully expect that the research would tell us that pulling the trigger too quickly could be pretty difficult for our students and our families, both directions. And I think that's part of what we want to try to find out too, is we want to make decisions that are based in this information, and also make sure that the data warrants those decisions, but also not be, in my mind, if we're switching, a week into this one, and then 2 weeks later we say it's time to switch to this one, and then 2 weeks later, I don't think anybody wants that. But, I think we do our best, and I think in my opinion, waiting to see some of the data from the holiday would be kind of the window of time. Is if we start to see a spike, then we would know that the impact in the community was going up from what we saw, kind of similar to the summer. And I think getting some information on what other states are doing might be helpful in using us to kind of build that algorithm.
And I think we also need to take into consideration getting everyone back in a building as well. Even though we did switch to an A day and B day to limit the amount of people that have been in the building, we still need to give that some time as well. As much as we want to be able to have families plan ahead, and we all have children in the district and families, and our planners ourselves, I'm not sure that we could put a timeline. I mean, it would be my hope that maybe by October sometime, but that's just thinking. But I think we have a lot of things to take into consideration. And this is looking great. We're at 1 week, but we have a lot of factors coming up that are going to come into play. So I think that we just need to proceed with a little bit of caution.
My final just comment on this document, and thanks to Scott Maben, I know I believe he was tasked with throwing this together, is I just wonder if we need a disclaimer on there, since Panhandle Health uses a similar matrix, that's this gauge isn't the lever that moves us from yellow to orange, or orange to yellow, or orange to red, that it's a decision of the board, and that this information and this gauge is just a data set for the board to use in our decision-making process. Because from some of the comments I've seen, whether they've been online or personally or through our emails, there's a belief like, okay, data's good, we're yellow, we're 5 days now. And I just don't want people to get the wrong information. So. Okay. Any other comments? All right, we made it through all those appendices there, I believe. And I'm going to go back up to the, yeah, there was a motion up earlier under number 3. Thank you, Ms. Brumley. And so we handled the first part, which was the language revisions to the policies. So we just went through the reopening plan. So now we'd be looking for a motion to approve the language revisions.
I'll make the motion to approve the language revisions to the proposed reopening plan, which would be Exhibit D to the COVID resolution.
Okay, it's been moved and seconded. Any discussion on the motion? Okay, all in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Aye. Motion carries, Ms. Town. So we were trying to go in 2 hours. It's clear to me we're going to be a little over 2 hours, but I'd like to limit that as much as we can. So let's talk the resolution here. We've looked at this document several times, and we had some amendments come back to us last week, language change. And I believe at that time we made a motion to approve the language. Is that correct?
Chair Morris, members of the board, the board has already approved the language of the resolution that's presented. The only change from last Monday is now the exhibits are officially named. So I believe the board, given the approvals that it's just made, is there should be a motion prepared to adopt the resolution and call out each of the exhibits that are to be attached. And this would be the formal adoption of the plan and all of the policy changes that the board's been reviewing.
Okay. If we move back up to item 3, that verbiage was in there. Someone would like to make a motion?
I'll go ahead. Motion to adopt COVID Resolution 2021-001 with the following exhibits. A, Policy 3520. B, Policy 5405. C, Policy 5215. And D, the district's reopening plan with appendices.
Okay, thank you. It's been moved and seconded. Any discussion on the resolution or on the motion? Okay, all in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Motion carries, Ms. Town. Okay, I gotta get back to my agenda here. Survival science. So this was a new course proposal that came to us at our August board meeting. Normally it'd be out for a 30-day public window, and we made it an exception, so this course could be approved or be considered for approval, I guess, before the school year. So it's been out for public comment. One public comment was received that was very supportive, and that was in our board packet. So any questions, comments, concerns on Survival Science 3?
No.
Okay, is there a motion to approve Survival Science 3 as presented then?
Second.
Okay, it's been moved and seconded. Any discussion? Okay, all in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Aye. Motion carries. Okay, we have some information items here. And the first one up is a resolution. I think Dr. Cook alluded to this, another resolution for us to consider. This would go under, I believe, the reopening plan. And this would come back to us next week, or are we going to go a few weeks out?
It could, I would suggest that we just have it done before a change is determined in the category status. I think it, ultimately, this is procedural mostly, I think. It's establishing the board's authority to be the entity that changes the status of the district's kind of position in category status, whatever that category status looks like, and clearly delineates the reasons and why the board holds that authority. Megan, would you like to add anything to that?
Dr. Cook has great explanation. I think the only reason that we pulled this one out separately, just so the board understands, this is the only thing that we've expected to potentially be revisited on a more regular basis, and certainly has very different findings than the other COVID resolution findings. So that's why it's been pulled out separately, and it can be used by the board as frequently as the board chooses to revisit the category determination.
Megan, was this a recommendation from the State Board of Education, or was this something locally that we thought would be in our best interest?
Yeah, that's a great question. This has not been recommended by the state, to my knowledge. We're trying to do as much formal approval by the board as we can for several reasons, but to just formally package what the board is looking at, what findings it's making, and frankly, for liability reasons, to just firmly set that this is the board determination that's being made. It's not something that's being done by administration. It's a decision of the board that gets administered by administration.
Thank you.
Okay, and so this will be a standalone resolution, won't live under the other one?
Correct.
Is that correct? Okay. But like the other one, as we change, so it's going to be whatever it is, 001, and then if we update it, we move from orange to yellow, it'll be resolution 002A or whatever it is. There'll be a progression.
Correct, yeah, and I think Board Clerk Lynn Town could probably weigh in on what the actual number is, but I suspect this one would be 002. As amendments are made to the plan or to other policy changes, those would be, Amendment 1 to Resolution 001, and would track that document, and the category changes would separately be held in 002 plus amendments.
Okay. So, Ms. O'Dowd, do we need to, obviously we made a decision last week that put us at the orange level to start. Are we going to adopt this resolution for that decision that's already taken place, or we'll use this going forward?
And I'll defer to Dr. Hook as well. I believe the decision on Monday stands alone. This we just put together so you can, moving forward, use it as changes come into play. And certainly, and it's just for information tonight anyways, but if the board has any, Dr. Cook and the administration have put a great deal of time together on these, gatekeeping factors that the board is considering. So certainly if the board would like to see different language called out, it can be modified every time as we go. I think that's certainly the level and the dates would be modified every time, but if there were other specific findings or factors that the board wanted to see, if we look at finding 1, the 3 main ones that Dr. Cook has spelled out, the incident rate, positivity rate, and hospitalizations are the 3 main factors.
Might it be prudent to reference this document in some way of the resolution, since this is likely, there could be other factors, but I certainly see this, and I apologize, I don't remember what the key metrics for COVID risk category seems to be the title. We've given that in some ways, and maybe have it be an appendix that's attached to that resolution at the time we're making the decision, so that there's a record of what we were working from.
Absolutely, I think that's a great suggestion. And so we could do something similar, make it Exhibit A with the updated data points that the board's considering. I think that's a great idea.
Could it be, or should it be a whereas then? Whereas the district developed a, whatever you called the document?
Yeah, we can identify it both in the recitals and throw it into either finding 1 or make a new paragraph 2 that reiterates it, I think would be appropriate.
Okay. Any other questions, comments? All right. So two more kind of big information items under here. The first one's about contract tracing, cohorting, and kind of COVID testing. And this came out of our conversations last week. This was a request that we at least touch on these items in cohorting. We kind of already have a little bit. And then the other one is the emergency mask policy that we saw last week. I think that made its debut last week. And we need to take action on that before school starts. And so it's here for comment from us or to get feedback from us tonight. I know we're planning on being done by 7. Are we okay with maybe 7:30 and we try to spend 15-ish minutes or less on kind of these two subsets? And is that adequate time? Okay. So let's shoot for that, Dr. Cook. I'll let you get started with
So, as you mentioned, Chair Morserow, that we've talked a little bit about contact tracing and cohorting. Actually, we've talked a little bit about testing as well, but I'm going to ask Nicole Piekarski to jump on and just kind of introduce this at a 30,000-foot level. I think ultimately what we'd like to do is to really start socializing what those things might look like, and then maybe in a future meeting talk a little more in depth about each of these. So if we could take just a little bit of time to talk about those, and potentially we might need Kelly Nichols and Dr. Katarosco to also jump in on the cohorting piece if we get into some specifics about what it might look like in classrooms. But I'm going to turn it over to Nicole to kind of just glance around those three things for a little while.
Yes, thank you, Chair Marisro, members of the board, and Superintendent Cook. I hope that you can see the contact tracing workflow graphic. I'm going to be working from that and just kind of walk through the steps on what this will look like in the district. So we are relying on individuals to self-report, and we have here a self-report to the supervisor. So that may be a parent or guardian that reports to the school office or the teacher or coach perhaps, or it could be an employee who reports to their supervisor. And when we say report, we're talking about a positive case. For example, my student has tested positive for COVID-19, or that my student, or if I was a district employee, I would be reporting that I was in close contact with a known positive case. And so we want to share that information through the supervisor gets that information from the self-report, and then the supervisor we want the supervisor to share that information through the district COVID-19 reporting form. And so a district nurse will be assigned to triage that case, and that district nurse will look through the information that's shared in that reporting form. They may reach out to that individual that's self-reported or the parent guardian of that individual to get some more information. And then they will, through school health, we have some documents approved through Panhandle Health Department for needed mitigation measures, and then establishing return dates. So school health will work through the case initially and establish what is needed there, and then notify our district command, which would involve Superintendent Cook and the COVID team to initiate communications and then section responsibilities. And so communications that would go out include internal communications to building administrators, perhaps the school nurse, because maybe the school nurse in that assigned building was not the one triaging the case that day. Office staff that need to know exclusion dates for attendance. Teachers also would need to be notified of those exclusions, and then perhaps athletic directors if this is a student athlete, and human resources as well if this is an employee. And so when we say notification, we are talking about that general statement of you have perhaps been identified as a contact of someone who is positive, or there's a positive in the classroom. We will not be disclosing personally identified information of affected individuals, but all groups that need to know information will receive the information that they need to know. And that includes external communications that will go out to affected families and groups. And this is where we're really hoping that cohorting will help us a significant amount with the number of communications that have to go out, that if we're really dialed in on staggered scheduling, assigned seating, and cohorting, we're hoping to reach only those directly impacted individuals. The other sections that will have responsibilities include operations, school health. Nurses will do contact tracing in collaboration with the health department. So we will be contacting the families and our employees. Actually, our employees will go through the health department. We will be working with our custodians, though, in our operations to make sure that we clean and disinfect the impacted areas. So we'll be working with our student families to contact them and do that first ring of contact tracing. And then when an employee reports to us, we will not be doing contact tracing for them, but we will still do the same measures for operations and our sections impact on planning, really looking at the metrics and how they might, not the key metrics, I'm sorry, but looking at the situation magnitude and severity, and then also allowing for input of the metrics there when we're trying to evaluate, is this one case in one building or is this 15 cases in one classroom? We'll also be looking at logistics and working with Jeff Fuller in operations to make sure that we have the ability to replace our consumed PPE supplies and any other needs that need to be met as we work through our contact tracing process and our workflow. And then financial as well in those sections, complete responsibilities categories. And then that brings us down to this longer arrow, which is our time frame for exclusion, which would be quarantining or isolation. And 48 hours prior to a student or employee return, we're going to want to reach out to them and do a little check-in, kind of a courtesy call, and then follow up with them when they return. So our overall goals in this whole process are really to protect the health of district staff and students, control the spread of COVID-19 in our buildings, make sure that everyone who needs to know information has the information they need, make sure that we're keeping a pulse on what's really going on with magnitude and severity in our buildings, clean those impacted areas and get them opened back up again, and then document our response and make sure that we're taking note of things we've learned along the way so that we can get better each time we do this.
Okay, so questions or comments around that?
I think just a general comment. I think of all the things, this is the part that gives me the most heartache, especially as I just think about our working parents that don't have the flexibility in schedules to stay home, and yet it's so important for the safety and just the general health of all of our students and our staff. So I think it's important that even now our parents are made aware that that students can be quarantining, for 2 weeks' time, and to be preparing now for who's going to potentially watch their kids or to make those accommodations, in their lives now. Because I think this part is going to be the hardest to manage for our families, and it's hard. So.
Nicole, I have a question. I think you stated something in there about that the name of the infected person wouldn't be disclosed, which I understand on a broad sense, but is that in any instance? Meaning, I envision, let's say it's a teacher, and if it's a student in their class, that it may be important for them to know who that person is, right? Because they could say, oh, well, I saw so-and-so, and, they touched or they hugged, or I worked with that student, he was upset and I worked with him and I was close, and I guess.
We will be interviewing the individual that's affected. And so we would, for the example of a teacher, we would go back to the teacher and ask, where were you in the 48 hours prior to your symptom development? And really do a good interview trying to grab all of that information. I think that you bring up a good point on if we have a teacher that tests positive, it may be very difficult to protect that teacher's name, given that people might be able to connect A with B with C, but we are obligated to follow HIPAA in the contact tracing activity, and so we would not want to disclose that person's name, and we would, in any circumstance, if we had question or concern, be able to reach out to Panhandle Health and ask how to best handle these types of situations.
Yeah, being that this is Coeur d'Alene, I have 100% confidence that there will be, it'll be well known when a staff member tests positive. I was referencing more in the student realm, I guess, that if a student, and maybe it's even more so in a secondary situation or something, but a student tests positive, I would think it'd be important for their teachers to know who that student was, because they may be able to help in contact tracing, but is that not the case?
I'm pausing there because we'll want to handle every case individually, I suppose, or delicately, you may want to say. But I think we will need the very valuable information of the teacher potentially. If we were to go in the classroom, we would be asking, where does this student sit, and where have other students sat? And on this day, during this time, what were the classroom activities that occurred? Are you confident without all doubt that every student stayed away 6 feet? And if not, which students were within 6 feet of each other for 15 minutes? So I do think it will be very important to get the input of the teachers, particularly if they're in a classroom with a student all day. They're really going to have some very valuable information that we need.
Ms. O'Dowd, I believe we had a language modification that we approved that would allow us to make those disclosures on a need-to-know basis. Is that correct?
Chair Morrisroe, members of the board, there are exceptions to FERPA on emergency, health and safety emergency situations. So you cannot apply that as a blanket exemption, certainly. And there will be case-by-case situations where we can help work with Nicole's team to help evaluate, and we're kind of working on potential documents without overburdening an already document-intensive system, where under the right circumstances, where there is a health and safety emergency, and certainly COVID would qualify, and under the right situation, we could disclose to need-to-know individuals, as long as that's happening on a case-by-case basis and we've properly documented that it's appropriate and to whom we have shared that information. I think that we certainly could get there.
Finished?
And if I may, the other thing is some parents may consent, and I think that's something that we could certainly remind folks of here, is anytime that's the extreme where you don't have to have parental consent and you can still share this information. Certainly anytime a parent consents to disclosing student's name, we can do so, and we're well within FERPA limits that way too.
Megan, so do FERPA overrule HIPAA?
Yeah, so it's interesting, and Nicole could weigh in on this too, but for students, FERPA absorbs HIPAA.
Okay.
But for staff, it's HIPAA. They don't have FERPA rights. So we have to live under both models. But for our students, as long as we're complying with FERPA, we've met the HIPAA guidelines.
That was not my original question, but
Oh, sorry.
Nicole, my original question was under goals for contract tracing workflow on number 4, assess situation, magnitude, and severity. And during a normal season or a normal flu season, Panhandle monitors absentee rates and alerts, I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, alerts you if we have over a 10% absentee rate at any school, or maybe you alert them. What will be your guys' kind of flow sheet as you do that number 4 to determine when a school has to be closed down? Is that something we're going to kind of wait and see, or is that already something the CDC is giving you guidelines on? I know across the country, Georgia's been dealing with some of these situations, and some schools have closed, and other schools have stayed open. But what does that thought process look like if our parents are watching?
We are talking.
Before Nicole starts, can I clarify when you say close down, you're referring to going into like
Temporary
remote
shutdown.
learning, right? Okay.
For that school, not for the entire district, but for that school.
So we have talked with Panhandle Health about that, and as we learn more about COVID and we learn more about what we're capable of, we had some experiences this summer with putting mitigation measures in place, and we believe we saw some success with that, meaning additional cleaning and cohorting and contact tracing. So we have talked with the health department about, will there be a line that we cross and we must close, or is it possible that we could assess these on a situation by situation basis? And the health department has agreed that we're probably looking at a case-by-case situation determination, meaning will an entire school have to close because we have one case? Not necessarily. We really are going to try and look very closely at could it be a smaller group of children? Could it be just a wing of a school where we know that there was a common bathroom and a common space used? And the reason we would close is not because all of those children have to quarantine for 14 days, but rather we want to close that space, sanitize and disinfect the impacted areas, and then reopen. So right now we're going to go with, it's going to be on a case-by-case basis, and we are going to try to close the smallest area that is safely possible to make the cleaning possible.
Is there that hard line metric though, like with flu season, that if we see, is it 10%, is that correct? That if we see a general 10% absentee rate at any given school, you guys start doing investigation?
We certainly do look at absentee rate of 10%. It depends on what our schools are. We are really looking at trends, actually. So this week last year, what's the difference? Because we know we have some predictable patterns in all of our schools, really, for attendance. We typically see an increase greater than, or not an increase, but absentee rates higher than 10% during active flu season when it gets pretty bad. We, in the past, have seen schools in our area close when they had greater than 30% absentee. And sometimes schools have closed, not maybe in our district, but not when their absentee rate was 30%, but they actually didn't have enough staff for the building because staff were sick and substitutes. So it would, if you're asking about, absentee rates kind of being an overall indicator of community illness, and if we throw the flu season in there too, it does get pretty complex. But those numbers greater than 10%, we would pay attention to. Greater than 30%, there seems to be an interest by the health department to take action on that. But if we had more than 30% of our students absent during flu season, we probably would see high rates of absenteeism in our staff as well.
I think parents are going to be curious about those numbers, as they do their own personal assessment of whether they feel safe to send their child to school if they know there's a known outbreak at a facility. So just whatever we can do to keep them updated and keep them assured that we're cleaning, we're taking proper precautions to keep our schools open, if at all possible.
I do think it'll be interesting. I think you might be suggesting that we would see an increase in absenteeism after we closed and cleaned a school, and that might not be associated with flu, even if it's in flu season. I think that might be something we would anticipate, and we could keep trends on that so that we don't misinterpret that absenteeism rate.
I was just more thinking, just so parents, I think Chair Mercer had a good point that once we have one positive case, it's going to be telephone and everybody's going to know about it. And so just assuring parents that we're monitoring it, we're cleaning appropriately, and we're managing.
Okay. Should we move on to cohorting and any more discussion around that? Or is there a need for more discussion around that? Hearing none? Okay. Let's talk maybe briefly about testing and what that might look like, or what the district's working on in that regard.
Go ahead, Nicole.
Okay. We have been having some conversations with local community partners, and we know that the state Department of Health and Welfare is interested. Well, there's some money for education for testing for staff. So we're continuing those conversations, and hopefully we'll be able to bring back to this group a solid plan on how we can get perhaps some fast track testing for our staff. We, for student testing, will probably be communicating with doctors' offices and giving parents information about where they can go to call and get more information about that for their students. And so it would look like at this point in time that we will probably not have on-site testing, but that we would have some solid lines for COVID testing have been too long in the community, right? Solid routes for our staff to easily get tested on the day that they need it.
So basically streamlining the process to make it easier for staff who choose to get tested or need to be tested to do so.
Yeah, established relationships, and so kind of like hopefully even just one phone call, because we've got the process in place and we can send it over.
Questions on that?
Heritage Health in the past, we've had an MOU with them, and we haven't had that on our agenda yet for this coming year, but is that something when they're doing their mobile unit that they could do some COVID testing for us? I don't know if Nicole wants that one or Dr. Cook.
At this moment in time, we, as a community, have COVID testing available to us at the fairgrounds and then also at the hospital. And so we are talking with Panhandle in some of their community partnerships that they have with Heritage Health and Northwest Specialty Hospital, and what that might look like. We do still work with Heritage Health, although we have not approached that conversation for testing on the mobile unit.
And I thought the last I had heard from Heritage, just due to staffing issues, they're not running the mobile health clinic currently, or they weren't at the end of, or during last school year, I think.
Correct. They were running into some pretty substantial staffing issues, and that was the last update we had on that conversation.
Okay, almost to the finish line. Last item up here is the emergency mask policy. And that's had, we've seen some comments on that. And I believe there's a few changes in here since we saw it last week. So Dr. Cook, I'll let you start and then we'll open up for comments.
So I think the best starting place is recognizing that when it comes to masks is that the plan to do everything that we can to keep kids and staff safe when operating in some form of risk in the community for community spread, that it places a substantial amount of trust in the use of barriers in the form of some kind of mask. We've used language right now that defines a mask pretty specifically, and we've actually built into this last version, after some feedback, that it might make more sense to actually declare at a policy level that the adults be responsible for actually providing some breaks for students, and that it does provide some authority for this to happen. And so I think the next step would be to determine to what extent we want those breaks to be controlled. We recognize right now that the CDC also does not recognize what we would call plastic face shields as an effective barrier to the transmission of the virus. While it does qualify as like an ADA accommodation, it does not serve as a similar purpose to a face mask at this point, and is nowhere in the CDC guidelines that it serves in that capacity. So I think what we're looking for at this point is whether or not the feedback on the masking policy meets the board's expectations, and whether or not we would, whether the board would want to accept the language regarding the face shields, accept the language regarding mask breaks, and any other. And then if so, we'd like to get this pushed out in front of the community to start accepting public comment. Right now, we've got the old, there's a little bit of timing issue right now with the way we're trying to move pretty quickly on this, and we've got a version of this that out there that we've since made some modifications based upon feedback, and we would like to get at least the most updated version, whether that's this or one that the board would like to opine on in front of the public for feedback as soon as possible.
Okay, so let's go ahead and share any comments, questions, concerns around really the document or the red lines in specific that have been made, which is an update to what we saw last week.
So my comment would be, I see the mask breaks as something that's utilized when we're in more of a green or yellow. I guess they're recommended in green. So in yellow, when we're there 5 days a week and we have a lot more students. I guess what I would like to see put in or incorporated in some way is some discretion by teachers and supervisors of students to be able to allow kids to not have to have masks on when social distancing measures are in place. I think particularly in our blended model, when the very intention is to have kids separated out in a classroom, that there needs to be the ability. And I feel like the language of, maybe approved by a superintendent or designee is too high up, and that there needs to be some specific acknowledgement that teachers or supervising staff members around kids, and I am certainly not opening the door to students making that decision, but I feel that adults taking care of those students should be able to make that decision when we have social distancing measures in place in a classroom. Particularly, I don't think this applies to monitoring hallways for social distancing. If kids want to take their masks off, that's not going to be an option. I don't see this as entryways where you might not have anybody around you and you're coming through the entryway. I see this more specific to a classroom design. So I kind of wanted to add back in the language a little bit of the red line, but reword it, something to the effect of students may remove masks as determined by superintendent, designee, teacher, or supervising staff member when appropriate social distancing measures are in place. That's just out there for food for thought. I just feel like we don't have anything in here other than in the breaks that infers like a removal from the classroom or infers a going somewhere else. And I think there needs to be some liberty allowed in the classroom.
So Vice Chair Brumley, I want to make sure I understand the premise of that modification and the idea of, for example, if we've got 12 kids in an AP World History class that are spread out substantially in the classroom, that what you're seeking is the authority of the teacher to be able to say, okay, we're looking and doing just the visual, and we can see that everybody's spread out, that in that regard, it would be acceptable for a teacher to say, okay, we believe under these circumstances the masks could come off. But the teacher holds that authority in that particular regard, not necessarily that an individual in that classroom can look around and say, hey, I think I'm more than 6 feet away, I can take my mask off. Is that clear?
That's exactly what I'm saying.
Okay.
I had a question regarding that. What would worry me about that is that we have parents who are expecting consistency in a policy, and we're adding the opportunity for staff members to make that unique decision, and we're not wholly sure how the virus is transmitted. So in a classroom, for instance, in a portable classroom, even if we only had 8 students and a teacher, and they're not wearing masks, and we have an asymptomatic student, and they're breathing out particles, and our limited air conditioning or HVAC is, spreading that virus and not knowing. From a liability piece, I wonder if it one would be difficult for the teacher to have to make that decision, and 2, is it the right? you know, would you want it for all categories, or are you thinking green and yellow, or?
Well, I don't know that it's passable in yellow because there will be so many students, but I feel like in orange, when we have half of our students there, that there should be some discretion there.
I think some of the models that have demonstrated how the virus spreads even through breathing and coughing and asymptomatic patients, that would give me pause. Even if we're sitting this far apart and I have COVID and I don't know it and I'm breathing and it's spreading throughout the classroom, I think wearing a mask would protect other students even if we were social distancing. And as a parent, I would be anxious, even at the level that we're at now, if a teacher made the decision that they weren't going to require masks, but we had a policy and we signed our student up for in-person learning when possible. I think that's a lot of inconsistency, and it makes me feel uncomfortable. For teachers especially, because then teachers are going to get pressure from students to, hey, so-and-so took off, let's take our masks off. Why can't you do the same? And it would be difficult to enforce. Or if parents are uncomfortable with that, and then the teacher's dealing with so many different opinions in any given day, it would be challenging.
Yeah, I was thinking that too, along the lines of this teacher allows us to do that, like the same thing that we ran into with our cell phone policy, right? Like, well, we can have it out here, and then all of a sudden you're just making teachers who are it's just, yeah, that's what popped into my head in that. But I do get that, and I do see the reasoning of wanting to have more time of kids, you know, without the mask on as well. But
Yeah, I mean, I guess I questioned that red line where that was struck. There was kind of that opportunity, really put it at the student level or the visitors level, the staff level, that they could do it. And I understand why we wouldn't make that on a case-by-case basis, but I even think, yeah, teacher, okay, my kids are, you know, I'm going to use an elementary model, but okay, my kids are antsy and I can see they're fiddling with their face masks. Let's go to the gym, or let's go outside and have an opportunity to read, you know, and spread out on the playground. And I'm not sure this policy even allows for the removal of the mask, you know, unless it's under the mask, unless you call that the mask break, I guess. Right, which
How do you
to me,
schedule
a
them?
mask break is more like, okay, at 10 o'clock, you know, it's going to be on the board, right? You know, and we do this, and we do this, and we do this, and at 10 o'clock, we're going to go outside and take a, you know, it's a recess, you know.
I think one of the things we've been perhaps, I don't know that I'd say struggling, but one of the challenges is how do you still maintain some semblance of what's the collective expectation for keeping the health of the class, like of a smaller community, not the entire community, but like a classroom community. But then allow for, there's some times when arguably the masks could theoretically come off because of the way that people are in the classrooms together. And I think that's part of what we were anticipating, the idea of, I think what we call it, like a social distancing, wear a mask when socially distancing isn't feasible. The opposite of that is if social distancing exists, then theoretically right now, I think we could all arguably take our masks off in this room, right? Because I think we've done a pretty decent job of spreading out for the, 10 of us or 12 of us that are in here, that we wouldn't necessarily need to be wearing our mask. And I think there are times where it's probably not unreasonable to allow those masks to come off. And I think that's what we're trying to capture is when do those happen, and where does that authority and that discretion live? I can tell you one thing that we're concerned about is we don't want that to be a student-based decision, that it's concerning for us that a student would have that, you know, if we say when socially distancing is possible, then, because then everybody's walking around visually estimating what's 6 feet, okay, I can take my mask off. And that's not a situation. First of all, it now makes teachers and staff become the logistic police of the mask wearers, and that's not what we want to accomplish, but we do see a situation in which that might make a lot of sense in circumstances, so.
Trustee Brumley, if we put language there for outside, if the teacher had the ability to make the decision if learning was happening outdoors?
Well, but I think we preclude November through February. If we do that in this community, I guess here's what I'm coming from it is in that all the recommendations coming out of those that are telling us to wear masks, it's when you're inside of 6 feet. And I know what you're talking about, Trustee May, with regards to the expulsion factor. But again, the recommendations are if you're outside of 6 feet that masks aren't required. We are extending beyond that with our policy. And I really struggle in creating an environment when we're in blended learning and we know what the recommendations are to insist that when kids are sitting here like this for 5 hours, that the teacher doesn't have discretion to have them take their mask off. That's where I'm coming from. And I 100% appreciate what you're saying. And it just may be a difference of where we're each coming from on that one.
I think what we could do, this is for information tonight. It's not for action. I believe we're going to have it for action at our, which meeting? Next Monday. Okay. So maybe we have some time as individual trustees just to look at language. Ms. Brumley, I know you rattled something off there, but maybe share that with us and, it's an idea we can kick around or Ms. May, maybe you suggested a tweak there, so maybe you can take what Jen had and tweak it a little bit, and maybe we can come up with something that we're all comfortable with.
I'm not quite sure how to ask this question, but maybe you can speak to it. Is just we've had so many comments, especially with our kids with disabilities and just some of the challenges that those kids face. And maybe you could speak to that both from a legal standpoint, because the comments come pretty regular regarding those kids and families and we want to understand what's do what's best for all kids. And so let's speak to that a little bit, please.
Yeah, so 7:35.
Oh, sorry, but
Yes,
if
at a
next Monday
7:30
we're
meeting.
approving it, I think.
No, and I think
speak to it
it's a very important factor, and I think that's part of the reason why, number one, we left that in as a component of there are going to be people that qualify for some kind of dispensation on this, and we have no intention of removing that from those students and those staff, and but there also are pretty strict criteria for what constitutes that, and whether it's some form of a disability or people who need to see mouths to be able to do it. We've looked into and have purchased some masks with the clear screen so that you can see the mouth moving. There are so many layers of complexity to this conversation, of which, if you ask me, do I think there will be face shields in our schools? I do believe the answer is going to be yes, because it's even with the CDC, it's the number one recommended accommodation when it comes to how do we handle people that for whatever medical reasons can't wear masks. And so I do anticipate that that's going to be a factor, but I don't anticipate that it's going to be that 50% of the people that are going into our schools are going to say, hey, I need an accommodation, therefore I need to wear a face shield instead of a face mask. But that's a conversation that we take very, very seriously. And maybe I'll kick it over to Megan for further detail on that.
Yeah, and I think Dr. Cook is right here that this could be hours of conversation. It's probably one of the biggest ones that we're dealing with right now. We are working on some FAQ that I think should help when it gets fine-tuned a bit, that can be pushed out and hopefully educate parents and patrons on this. So I think the important piece to start with is that we're living under the Americans with Disabilities Act. So certainly we will be making accommodations. They are by law done on a case-by-case basis. It is different. I mean, the district has the authority and the ability to require doctor's notes. So I think that's an important distinction to make. And as Dr. Cook said, there probably will be some situations where a plastic face shield, perhaps with some other safeguards in place, is the best recommendation. Because the we don't have a lot of standards right now. One thing that the CDC has said is that cloth masks is really where we need to be, and face shields are not equal to a cloth mask. But there will, on a case-by-case, in that interactive process, there will undoubtedly be situations where it is appropriate to allow a student or a staff member with other measures, maybe the staff member is behind a podium with a little extra buffering to help safeguard. So it's not just there will never be a blanket face shields are the appropriate alternative. We have to go through that interactive process with each student and staff member.
And it's a couple things. I think one, there was a narrative that I saw online, and I couldn't tell you what district it was reflective on. I believe it was us, but it said, if you can't live by the policy, then your accommodation is you can do online school. And I don't think we ever said that. In fact, I know we never said that, but that was the narrative that was out there. So we fully anticipate that there will be accommodations made on a case-by-case basis that would still allow for in-person learning.
Absolutely, and they'll go, the district and the administration is going to go through the whole gamut of options. I think the e-school will probably be the last option. Certainly any parent could request that, and that would be an easy, appropriate accommodation. But there's a lot of room in between there where a child has a documented disability, acute asthma, traumatic stress, autism, where the mask, and there will probably be measures that the district will take to try, because a lot of the materials provide that there will be, so for a student that has sensory issues or autism, there may be training that the student undergoes. So even that student's accommodation will work with you to help get some comfort with masks. So maybe it's 2 minutes a day, 5 minutes a day. And so the point of this is that there is not going to be just one answer. It's going to be broad, specific to the student's needs, and after evaluating really all of the options. And like Dr. Cook said, there are some really, frankly, new cool things that are coming out to try to, the plastic mouth to try to accommodate folks who are teaching phonics, so you can still see and hear and see the movement of the mouth may be appropriate for a staff member, for example.
So this form would be the form that parents would be taking to their physicians and having complete. And then as I look at it, it looks like the proposed accommodations are then written by the physician, correct?
Correct. So the doctor would usually start with an ideal, like I think student should be in a plastic shield, and that doesn't obligate the district to provide, and it's going to be this constant interactive balancing process. So if that is the recommendation, certainly then the district starts that interactive process and says, okay, if that's the recommendation, can we accommodate that without an undue burden? That's always the balancing act. Now, interestingly enough, cost has always been the undue burden, but now it's really safety, health and safety of staff and students. So can we meet this request and still provide to this health and safety of staff and students to a degree that the district is comfortable with?
Meg, I had a quick question. Could you speak to Panhandle's mask mandate, the ordinance or the order that did it talk about all indoor situations, or was there a qualifier for when socially distancing? Because I thought it was for all inside masks must be worn. Do you have it in front of you? I don't have it.
I don't have it open in front of me, but I think that's a good thing to bring up. The board here has independent authority, right, to mandate masks. There are limits to the health district's order that may not apply in all settings for the school district, and frankly, they have different rules. So because they're applying something across the board, there's no ADA exemption consideration. So I think it's important to note that what the board is considering and would be adopting is based on its own independent authority here.
I'm just thinking about Trustee Brumley's comments earlier about liability, and if we go against a Panhandle recommendation, does it make us liable? So it'd be something to look into, I think, to see how their mandate was written.
Actually, I think that was answered in a prior email we received. Panhandle Health District's mandate does not extend to the classroom. And very specifically, that's been stated. And there's another district in Idaho, the Eastern District, actually modified their order to include classrooms. And as I understand, Panhandle Health is not doing that.
Right, I just mean from a liability perspective, if we're going against our partner and they're recommending metrics and they're recommending masking or the use of masking and we're not, is that in our students' best interest? I'm not
Yeah,
sure.
but
It's
their
something-
mandate doesn't go into the classroom. And so that's why it's us. And that's why I said we are going beyond what has been recommended by Panhandle with how I read this. And that's why I was trying to offer some flexibility into it.
And I think the baseline is the same. It's, I mean, across the board, it's still 6 feet, right, or masking. The district can, because we're constantly looking for what is the standard of care, and I think Nicole spoke to some of the risks that the district walks into if they don't follow the masking, and those are not necessarily legal implications, but it's the potential health risks of. So we're putting teachers in a situation where if we're in the blended learning, and we have the ability to space kids out, the minimum standard of care that we must meet is the 6 feet. So do we put that burden on the staff to, monitor and police that? And I'll say the intent was certainly with the mask breaks was to give that flexibility. So we probably just didn't do a very good job with the language, and we can work on that. And I think Dr. Cook's point is a good one, is that we were trying to remove that sort of great discretionary power from staff, or not staff, from students and visitors, and to make sure that there is a uniform application of whatever the final standard is that's applied. So we'll work on some, hopefully, better language.
Last question that I have in regards to this policy for tonight. I think there was a few concerns I saw about disposable masks and people really jumping on the cloth word in there, but the way I read it, I guess, is generally made of cloth. So a disposable mask is something similar to what I'm wearing. It certainly falls underneath that definition.
Correct.
Right?
It generally isn't a mandate. It
Okay.
could be made of something else as long as it's some sort of type. And we could specifically call out a disposable mask. Yeah, we could specifically call that out. And I know there was some discussion too about the neck gaiters, and I don't know what the board's or Dr. Cook's position on that is, but I saw some comments about that recently as well.
Okay. We went 20 minutes beyond our 30 minutes beyond, so 50 minutes beyond here. Are we ready to adjourn for tonight, and we'll discuss this one more next week and have it for action next week? Okay. Thanks, everybody. Have a great night.